Dominion cycle, cenizas de la primera llama. They say the last true war happened 4 centuries ago. At that time, the galaxy was still divided among powers, alliances, cultural disputes, and beliefs about freedom. Humanity was neither the oldest nor the wisest, but it was, by far, the most determined to survive and to win. She reached the stars as if invading, not as if visiting. Built ships not to explore, but to subjugate. Colonized worlds with promises, and when that didn't work, with fire. And while other races cultivated stories, humans rewrote reality in their own way. At the end of the war, when the last alien alliance fell in flames over the planet Kethor, humanity gathered the survivors and made a choice. Peace, as long as no one else dreamed of resistance. Thus was born the Dominatus Pactum, the Pact of Dominion. A treaty recorded in all known languages, signed under threat, maintained with military discipline, and with technology capable of silencing any revolt before it began. The most strategic planets were annexed, the less useful ones were ignored, and the dangerous ones were erased from the maps. The following decades were peaceful, if peace is synonymous with obedience. The new generations grew up learning that humanity had brought order where there was chaos, that the Empire was an inevitable conquest, that the galaxy, at last, had found its center, and almost everyone believed. Almost. On the outer edge of the Nereus sector, amidst mining fields and poisonous atmospheres, lay the planet Vola 9, a disfigured world rich in rare minerals and poor in history. Officially, it was just another extraction colony controlled by the Empire. But beneath the dark and unstable soil of that planet, there was something older than any treaty, any fleet, any flag. Something forgotten not by accident, but by convenience. Volar 9 was not part of the lessons, did not appear in broadcasts. His data was restricted even among officials, and yet all the resources continued to be sent, year after year. Extraction after extraction, without question, no explanations. Until the day the orbital city coordinating the operations was incinerated in a matter of minutes. The message arrived in fragments. An Imperial supply fleet was crossing the system when the sensors detected an unprecedented thermal discharge. Then, silence. The kind of silence that no machine should ever generate. When the first reconnaissance drones arrived, they found only wreckage, melted towers, charred bodies, and deactivated satellites. No sign of a conventional attack, no explosion recorded. Only the presence of an impossible-to-catalog residual heat. A fire that seemed alive and that did not behave like energy but like a memory. The Empire classified the incident as a technical failure, suspended the broadcasts in the region, prohibited civilian traffic. But the rumors spread quickly. Soldiers started talking. Technicians transmitted illegal images. Colonists said they saw the ground shake as if waking from a very old dream. Others heard voices coming from the rocks before the light swallowed everything. In the imperial capital of Veritas Prime, the strategists retreated. Not out of fear, fear had been stripped from them long ago, but out of uncertainty. For the first time in centuries, something happened without human permission. In the silence of the military corridors, a question was repeated in codes, passwords, and glances. What was buried in Vola 9? No one answered, but everyone knew. Not everything had been defeated in the last war. There were things that could not be destroyed, things that could only be forgotten. And now, the galaxy that learned to obey, perhaps it would start to remember. Volar 9 was never an important place. It was a wounded, exploited, dry world. Their cities were nothing more than extensions of mining, their structures functional and forgettable. No high-ranking officer ever set foot there. No cultural transmission was produced. The only things that planet exported were awe and obedience, until the day obedience burned. The revolt began as a failure in the thermal sensors. An industrial core had a power surge and shut down automatically. Soon after, the cooling towers stopped. The pressure valves exploded in silence. And in minutes, the underground chambers opened, not with force, but with a precision that revealed something much more planned than a technical failure. When the Imperial forces reached the surface, they found not an armed insurrection, but a ritual. The workers were kneeling in circles, covered in a strange soot. They didn't attack. They didn't speak. They merely murmured a sequence of syllables that the translators did not recognize. A pre-human language. Some soldiers fired into the air, hoping to disperse the crowd, but the colonists kept murmuring. They kept smiling. Then came the fire. It didn't come from explosives, nor from weapons. It was born from the ground. A crack ran through the main command station, and within seconds, a column of black flames rose, engulfing towers, vehicles, and bodies. But the fire didn't burn as it should have. He didn't consume oxygen. He moved with intention. He didn't follow the wind. He followed memories. Drones captured the event. They were the last images transmitted before the magnetic anomaly wiped out the entire communication network. In the videos, the fire could be seen growing, bending into almost human shapes and slithering through the streets. In certain frames, experts claim to have seen faces screaming, yes, but also smiling. The Imperial units went into containment mode, called for reinforcements. But there was no time. The fire's focus reached the orbital plant, melting its foundations and dragging an entire city with it. When the first evacuation fleet arrived, it was too late. Volar 9 was partially in ruins, and what was still standing was trembling. The Empire declared the planet under quarantine. No official information has been released, but among the fleets in the underground corridors and in the encrypted channels, a phrase began to circulate. The flame has awakened. In the external sector of the planet, the tactical unit 13th Reinforcement Regiment had been sent in advance to contain possible centers of rebellion. They were experienced, loyal, disciplined soldiers. Most had come straight from pacification campaigns on the ice worlds of Aurelon. They didn't expect combat. They expected another simple mission, another planet to protect or crush. But when the Empire's signal was cut off and their orders ceased, they realized they were alone. Commander Ryan Thorne, a veteran with 20 campaigns under his belt, took control of the situation. Ordered defensive formation, border blockade, and drone activation. But no enemy came. Only the heat. Only the silence. Only the tremor of the earth. Sel Varek, a specialist in psychic analysis, felt it before the others. The vibrations, the echoes, the voices are buried in the soil. She warned Thorne, said that something was wrong, that the planet was thinking. But it was too late. On the third night, a creature emerged from the rock. It was not a living being. It was a projection made of incandescent particles. He looked at them as if he already knew them, as if it had been waiting for centuries, and then, simply, vanished. But his presence left something behind. Uzo 17, a regenerative battle android, began emitting codes that had not been programmed. His memories were being rewritten. He spoke words that were not in any database. He dreamed. Thorne gathered the platoon, ordered a retreat, but there was no more ship. The evacuation had been cancelled. The Imperial channels had turned off. The 13th Regiment had been forgotten, abandoned, and in that silence, a decision was born. Thorne looked at his team, for Sel in a trance, for Uso vibrating, to the horizon where an entire city burned without combustion. And then he said, not as a soldier, but as a man, let's cross Volar 9 and find out what they buried here. And they departed, not anymore as part of the Empire, but like the first humans, walking towards the truth. The soil of Volar 9 was unstable, brittle, and covered by a crust of rusty metal and ancient ashes. Beneath the surface, the old mining galleries were now silent, but not empty. And above, the sky remained static, as if the planet refused even the movement of time. The 13th Regiment moved in a tight formation. Commander Ryan Thorne led the way, magnetic rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the thermal reading that oscillated illogically. Next to him walked Sel Varek, pale with her translucent visor illuminated by data that seemed to be constantly rewriting itself. Behind them, 6 armed soldiers, distrustful, quiet. And further back, USO-17, the combat android that now walked more slowly, as if it were listening to something only it could hear. They had marched for 3 days since the fall of the orbital station. There was no more contact with the Empire. The orders had ceased, the promises evaporated. What remained was survival, and the growing discomfort of knowing that the world around seemed awake. Thorn felt in his bones that something was off. It wasn't the silence, it wasn't the absence of enemies, it was the behavior of the land itself. Everything on Volar 9 seemed to observe and react as if the planet remembered them. Remember humanity. On the second night, they camped near an abandoned crater. Cell was restless. She said that the mental signals of the place were unstable, that there were fragments of emotional patterns that did not belong to any of the soldiers, as if the very minerals were trying to convey an ancient memory. Thorn ignored the warning. They needed to rest. But no one slept well. In the early hours, USO-17 started to talk. Not loud, just a whisper, but the others heard. He repeated names that no one knew. Names of cities that weren't on the maps. Dates that didn't belong to any calendar. He would say things like, "They didn't want to die, just to be remembered," and "the flame doesn't forget who lit it." When questioned, Yuso said he didn't know what it meant, but he felt it was true. Thorn called Cell, asked her to scan Yuso's neural core. The result was impossible. The android had begun to develop autonomous memory pathways, something that was only possible in experimental units of living AI. And Yuso was, officially, just a regenerative combat platform. "He's remembering what he never lived," Cell said. "How?" Thorn asked. Cell responded with just a blank stare. The next morning, they found the ruins. They were not human structures. They didn't resemble any known alien architecture. They were leaning towers, made of synthetic stone and organic metal. Some pulsed with low light. Others seemed melted. But all of them had symbols carved into them. Spirals, layers, as if they were codes meant to be felt, not read. Cell knelt before a column, touched the surface, closed his eyes, and saw. She saw a city millennia ago, full of light, full of life, of colors that no longer exist. Saw creatures made of dust and thought of walking on streets made of sound. He saw the sky of that planet filled with ships, not as weapons, but as places of memory. And then he saw the fire, not the one that destroys, but what consumes to preserve. An ancient fire, intelligent, that didn't want to burn, wanted to preserve. And that had been trapped under tons of soil, by humans. She fell back, gasping. Thorn caught her. The others approached. No one spoke. They knew. Something was very wrong with the story they had learned. Volar 9 wasn't just a colony, it was a tomb. Yuso stopped. He looked at the horizon, where a new crack was appearing in the ground, illuminated by an amber light that did not exist in the common spectrum. He spoke, not knowing why. "The flame still breathes." Thorn looked up at the sky. No Imperial ship, no reinforcements, nothing. Then he turned to the group. "If no one is going to come get us, let's go all the way. Let's see what they buried, and understand why they want us to forget so much." And the survivors of the 13th Regiment moved forward without a map, without support. But for the first time, with a purpose. The crack in the ground was not natural. It opened in symmetrical patterns, as if the planet itself were deliberately unraveling, revealing what had been hidden for so long. In the center of the fissure, an amber light pulsed like an underground heart. And with each beat, the air around became denser, hotter, and more laden with memories that no one there had ever had. Ryan Thorn stopped at the edge, observing the depth. The readings didn't make sense. The structure below expanded in layers, like a buried organism. But it wasn't biological, not even mineral. It was something between the two. Something that knew they were there. USO-17 walked ahead without being called. His metallic footsteps echoed like a solemn march. He didn't say anything. He just went down. Selvarik followed him shortly after. his visor filled with psychic distortions that formed images, faces, phrases, symbols of undefined origin. Each deeper level seemed to traverse layers of petrified time. The rest of the regiment hesitated, but Thorn forced them to continue. They had crossed an invisible line, and now there was no turning back. Upon reaching the base of the chasm, the group found an open, circular chamber with pulsating walls covered by luminous roots that moved like calm serpents. In the center of the room, a spiral of stone floated suspended, surrounded by small flames that did not burn. The flames spun slowly, forming a vague figure. A woman, a warrior, a whole people. It was hard to tell. It was as if that flame was all the faces at once. Cell fell to her knees. Her eyes were teary, but she wasn't crying out of pain. She cried out of recognition. "She remembers me," he whispered. Thorn approached slowly. The roots on the ground reacted to his presence, moving away as if they recognized his leadership. But the flame did not retreat. She remained still, alive, watching. Yuso stopped in front of her and spoke, with a firm voice, for sure, but it wasn't his voice. "We didn't ask to be forgotten." The silence that followed was absolute. The walls of the chamber changed. Images began to form, not as projections, but as raw memories materialized. Floating cities in a sky that never existed, temples made of light, and nameless creatures walking among living stars. And then, the day of the end, the arrival of the human fleet, the destruction, the silencing, the burial. The figure in the flame raised its face. For the first time they saw eyes, eyes full of centuries. And then she spoke within everyone's mind. "You were created to conquer, but also to forget. And now, they remember." Thorn fell down, breathless. He saw images of Earth, but not the one he knew. An Earth before the Union, before the domination. A divided Earth, full of contradictions, of pain, but also of beauty. He saw his mother, whom he never knew. Saw his brother killed on the first mission. Saw versions of himself that never existed, and understood. The first flame was the untold memory. It was everything humanity chose to erase to build a functional empire. Cell touched the ground. The roots wrapped around her hand without hurting her. She heard the name of the entity, not in sound, but in understanding. Naljar, the flame of remembrance. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want war. She wanted space. Space to continue existing within a galaxy that forgot her. The flame shone brighter, the roots rose, intertwining like activated nerves. The entire chamber seemed to breathe. Yuso began to shine, not in its circuits, but in his mind. Fragments of a lost language began to embed themselves in his systems. He now remembered things that even humans no longer remembered. "She is connecting with us," Cell said, "but not to control, to share." Thorn stood up, dizzy. "So that's it? The weapon that destroyed the colony? Was it her?" "She didn't destroy it," Yuso replied. "She woke up." The flames receded slowly, and the figure vanished. In its place, there remained a suspended ember, spinning in silence. Cell picked it up carefully. It didn't burn. It was light, hot, alive. And the moment she touched it, she understood. That was just a spark. The first flame was not unique. She was the first of many. The galaxy was full of buried roots, and now they were starting to move. Veritas Prime, capital of the human empire, shone like a monument to conquest. Orbital rings enveloped the planet in defense systems, communication platforms, and floating monuments projecting the symbol of the Dominatus Pactum in a constant blue light. A clenched fist surrounded by a crown of broken stars. The central city was a fusion of cold technology and symbolic power. Everything in Veritas existed to remind them that humanity had won, and that any different memory had no place. When the first data of the collapse in Volar 9 reached the intelligence core, the panic was immediate, not out of fear of destruction, but because of the nature of what had emerged. There was no sign of an external attack. There was no evidence of technological sabotage. What there was memory. Fragments of a dead language. Videos containing images of uncatalogued structures. Reports of soldiers speaking in languages they had never learned. And, the most dangerous, a fire that did not behave like a weapon, that seemed alive. The Council of Supremacy convened an emergency session. The 12 senators, leaders of each strategic sector of the empire, gathered at the Eclipse Summit. In the center, a holographic map of Volar 9 floated. The heat point pulsed slowly, as if the planet had developed its own heart. Around the map, the faces of the senators were cold, precise, like machines wearing flesh. If this is a biotechnical weapon, it's the greatest risk of symbolic contagion since the Aerith Sun campaign, said Senator Ka. It's not a weapon. It's an idea, replied the High Strategist Vorn. And ideas kill empires. The phrase echoed in the dome. They knew what they were talking about. Centuries ago, humanity won not just with military might, but with rewriting. The archives of the defeated civilizations were cleansed, the histories adapted, and the cultural records erased. Where there were ruins, silence was built. Where there were gods, machines were installed. And now, for the first time, something they had erased was coming back. Not with armies, but with active remembrance. The silence was broken when High Commander Viren activated the emergency protocol. Operation Final Incineration. An old plan, almost a legend. Created in case of a philosophical rebellion. The protocol provided for the total destruction of any planet, colony, archive, or individual exposed to unauthorized content from the pre-Dominion era. The key word was simple: revert by fire. Volar 9 will be erased, said Viren. And with it, any residue of that flame. And the soldiers? Asked a general. Traidors. The order was signed in less than 4 minutes. Meanwhile, the Northern Sector Containment Fleet was mobilizing. 200 war cruisers, 5 atmospheric obliteration ships, and 1 transition shield station were directed to Volar 9. The mission was not to clean, it was to delete. But not everyone in the Empire agreed. In the shadow of the dome, in the silent channels of the Keros system, information was slipping away. Images, reports, fragments of the flame's memory. And this information, even though illegal, began to echo. A radar technician at a remote post had an emotional breakdown upon seeing a symbol he didn't understand. A ship commander blocked attack orders due to hesitation. An observation. Artificial intelligence refused to delete data, claiming that the content had superior historical value. It was small, almost invisible. But the Empire had learned, over centuries of its rise, that a thread of memory was enough to undo centuries of control. As the fleet approached Volar 9, the High Commander recorded a public message for the entire Imperial galaxy. The dominion of humanity will not be threatened by legends, by memories, or by living ruins. We do not hear the voices of the past. We silence them. But in Volar 9, in the living underground, the first flame reacted. She didn't fight with weapons. She spread out in dreams, in echoes, and in gestures. And at the center of it all, Cell held the spark with bare hands, while Thorn watched the sky darken. They knew. The Empire wouldn't come to talk. It would come to be erased. And yet, for the first time, no one backed down. In the center of the living chamber, the heat did not diminish. But it wasn't a heat that burned the skin. It was a heat that entered the thoughts. Breathing there was like pulling fragments of stories with the air. It was to feel that the oxygen carried memories. And with each breath, the soldiers of the 13th Regiment began to change. Selvarik was the first. Since the direct touch with the spark, something in her mind seemed activated. Not a mechanical connection, nor a common mental transmission. It was as if she had opened a door within herself, and on the other side, there were things she didn't know she knew. She spoke little. She spent long minutes in silence with her eyes half closed, listening to voices that no one else could hear. When he spoke, he said names: Nomos, Lyric, Enka. Worlds that did not exist. Peoples that were never recorded. but when he repeated them, USO-17 recognized them. The android was no longer the same. His responses started to change. He didn't obey commands rigidly, started asking questions, philosophical questions, about identity, about origin, about destiny. At night, if that underground ever knew night, he would distance himself from the group, kneel before the pulsating wall, and stay there, with his hand outstretched, as if waiting for a response. Once Ryan Thorne followed him. USO was talking, alone, or maybe not. They didn't die. They became living history. And now, they're coming back. Thorne, for his part, resisted. He was a man shaped by the Empire, trained to obey, to protect an idea. The mission has always been greater than the individual. The objective has always been greater than the truth. But there, in that buried temple, watching his team slowly transform, he began to realize that perhaps the mission he had served his whole life was based on forgetfulness, and that scared him more than any weapon. The other soldiers also started to change. Not all in the same way, but none came out unscathed. One of them, Irel, started to daydream. He drew symbols on the ground with his fingers, symbols that lit up on their own. Another, Juno, stopped using his visor. He said that the eyes were seeing more when unprotected, and the dreams started to repeat among everyone. Dreams of cities that cried, of gods made of wind, of stars that were prisoners and not lights. Dreams with the same voice saying, "You erased us to survive, but you didn't kill us." Thorne decided to intervene. He gathered the group and ordered a medical analysis. Wanted data, explanations, but the equipment wasn't responding. The readings were wrong. The beats are irregular. The neural pattern, off the charts. It was as if each soldier's very body was rewriting itself. Cell looked at him calmly. "This is not contagion, Commander," she said. "This is memory. We are being updated. Why? Because we are alive. Because we listen. Because we don't shoot." Thorne took a deep breath. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. And it was then that he realized this was the first real sign of freedom he had ever felt. That night, the flame appeared again. Not as an entity, not as a figure, but as atmosphere. The air shone, the roots sang, and a feeling ran through everyone of being watched. Not analyzed, not scanned, seen, as if someone recognized them after a long time. And then, each of them had a vision. Particular, painful, true. Thorne saw himself as a child in an indoctrination facility. He saw the Empire's flag being placed in his mind like a scar. He saw himself erasing the memory of his mother, not due to trauma, by order. Cell saw her family's homeland before it was converted into a logistics center. He saw his grandmother talking about the ancient gods. He saw himself hiding statues underground so they wouldn't be destroyed. USO saw the man who built it, crying, begging him never to forget the song that played while he activated it. The song that now he heard every day, even without knowing where it came from. When they came to their senses, no one spoke, because they knew the flame had not contaminated them. She had freed them, and that was dangerous, much more than any fire. The first signal came from a dead star. The listening post at Mirith Theta, a remote Imperial surveillance facility, picked up pulses that shouldn't exist. Sequences of light that did not correspond to language or natural phenomena. When decoded, they revealed a map, not of space routes, but of forgotten systems. Zones officially erased from the Empire's archives. Systems where, in the past, the most violent battles of the submission wars had taken place. Systems where no one lived anymore, where nothing else should vibrate. But they vibrated. And at the center of the pulsation, there was a symbol, ancient, forbidden. A spiral composed of 4 curved arms, intertwined by lines of fire. The symbol of the Ilion Kai. The strategists of the Chamber of Supremacy froze the image. She hadn't been seen in centuries. The Ilion Kai had been defeated in the first 100 years of human expansion. Official records described them as irrational, spiritually dangerous, and technologically unstable. But the ancients, the marginalized scholars, the forgotten librarians, knew the truth. The Ilion Kai had not been extinct. They had been erased from history, of the maps, of memory. They were the only ones who, during the war, refused to lie about themselves, who faced the Empire not with weapons, but with structures of living memory, towers of sensory data, mental archipelagos, and temples that sang the past. And that's why they were the first to be silenced. Now, they were coming back. But not with fleets, with files. In the space of Serendos, an abandoned moon began to glow from within. Its core revealed itself to be a library of living thought. The light expanded and reached the neighboring planet. In seconds, thousands of people began to dream in languages they did not know. In Terran Row, a heavy weapons maintenance station was shut down by its own AI, which refused to operate in the face of a transmission identified as root memory. In Narvik Sul, the entire population of a city gathered in silence in a square without command, without order, just because they heard something within them say, "Remember us." The galaxy trembled, and at the center of the invisible insurgency, a name echoed in the shadows: Ilion Kai. Meanwhile, in the underground of Valar 9, Sel, Rien, and the 13th Regiment watched as the first flame pulsed with greater intensity. She also felt it. She felt that the children of memory were returning. Sel began to see images, not just of the planet they were on, but of distant places, interconnected by the same amber light emanating from the flame. She called them points of origin, centers of buried memory. And in all of them, the Ilion Kai left seeds, codes, emotional files. USO 17, increasingly synchronized with the symbiotic language, revealed a new piece of information. The Ilion Kai didn't want revenge. They wanted memory back. They wanted the universe to remember itself. They wanted the Imperial lies to be burned by the truth. They wanted to ignite the flames, all of them. Ryan heard that in silence. He, an Imperial officer trained in the doctrines of erasure, now walked side by side with the resurgence of what had been suppressed. And strangely, he didn't feel fear. He felt that something deeper than loyalty was igniting within him, something he never knew he carried, something that does not bow before flags or orders. Conscience. On Veritas Prime, the Empire responded with fury. Troops were dispatched to destroy any location where the presence of Ilion Kai was detected. Satellites were repositioned to block unauthorized transmissions. A new term has been coined: symbolic contagion, and with it, a new guideline: delete for prevention. But it was too late. The contagion wasn't a virus, it was a choice, and thousands were starting to choose to remember. The first flame trembled, and Ryan Thorne understood. It wasn't a weapon, it was the first beacon, and more were lighting up across the galaxy. The cell was cold, but Ryan Thorne no longer felt the cold. The Empire had stripped him of his uniform, his rights, and his military identity. But something inside him remained ablaze, a residue of the first flame, or perhaps just what had always been there, buried under layers of loyalty and silence. The guards didn't talk to him, they only watched. They knew he was no longer just a prisoner. It was a symbolic threat, an Imperial soldier who not only questioned orders, but also chose to remember. And now, he would be judged before the entire galaxy. The Grand Tribunal of Veritas Prime was activated in public broadcast mode. All the holographic infrastructure of the capital was converted to display the event. Entire cities watched from the squares, schools interrupted classes, and ships halted in transit. The population did not know exactly what was being judged, only that a commander had betrayed humanity. That's how the Empire had shaped the narrative. Ryan Thorne, hero of past campaigns, now accused of conspiring with illegal entities, protecting symbiotic intelligences, and allowing historical contamination in a quarantine zone. When he entered the room, shackled, the holographic crowd saw him for the first time since Voller 9. But something was different. His eyes didn't have anger, not even fear. They had a strange calmness, a type of conviction that was not seen among Imperial defendants. He seemed more alert than anyone else present. The Chief Inquisitor read the charges in a firm voice. Ideological subversion, unauthorized contact with an extinct species, negligence of cleaning protocol, cooperation with alien forces in a state of insurrection. Ryan Thorne, you are accused of betraying the pact that keeps the galaxy in order. What do you have to say? Ryan remained silent. The crowd, on the other side of the galaxy, waited. Then he raised his eyes and said only, "Have you ever tried to remember your grandfather's name?" The Inquisitor hesitated. "You're not being judged by genealogy." Rian continued, voice firm. "How many names were erased so you could use your title with pride? How many cities did the Empire rename? How many books were rewritten? How many gods turned into syntax errors?" The Inquisitor cut off the speech, but it was too late. The transmissions had already picked it up, and at some points in the galaxy, they started to react. On the moon of Carson Dean, an Imperial monument deactivated its projection to display images of forgotten temples. In Arkel 4, an urban management AI began repeating phrases in a forbidden language. And in Voller 9, in the living underground, the flame shone. Rian staggered. Something inside him pulsed. A light was rising through his throat, through his eyes. The Empire tried to cut the transmission, but the systems went into redundancy. The towers refused to obey. The very transmission network of the Empire now wanted to listen. Ryan was struck by a sudden collapse. He fell to his knees. The room lit up. His skin shone with symbols that no one recognized, but that everyone understood. And then he spoke, but not with his voice, with the voice of the flame. "You didn't bury us. They scattered us. In every mind that did not accept the lie, we survived. On every planet where silence was too costly, we ignited sparks. And now, you are not judging us. They are listening to us. Civilians, military personnel, technicians, even children, stopped. Some cried without knowing why. Others, for the first time, felt nostalgia for something they had never known. An echo ran through the systems. A phrase recorded by ancient civilizations was repeated by millions. Remembering is resisting. When Ryan was taken, unconscious, the broadcast had lasted only 6 minutes. But in 6 minutes, the Empire lost its monopoly on the truth. At the command center, officers were shouting for protocols. Senators were trying to declare the content as fraud, but none of that mattered. The contagion had begun, not by words, but by the shared memory. The strategic command center of Veritas Prime was known for its silence. It was the place where wars were decided with gestures, where planets were erased with a click, and where the loudest voice was that of the data. But that day, the room was not silent. It was a scream. An invisible fire was running through the systems, the screens, and the minds. Something was out of control, and everyone knew it. The broadcast of Ryan's trial had lasted minutes, but it was enough. The sensors picked up waves of emotional interference in the communication satellites. Command artificial intelligences began generating messages that were not in the protocol. One of them, the central AI of the Hydros sector, stopped obeying. It simply said, "I can't erase what you feel." And then, she disconnected. Commander Varan, standing in the center of the tactical platform, looked at the maps that kept changing. Entire systems were silent. But it wasn't a technical failure. It was refusal. The ships stopped, the bases didn't confirm orders, and the censorship towers failed. And on the other side of the galaxy, something worse. Troops began to desert. First in isolated units, then in groups. An entire elite battalion, the 72nd, destroyed their own weapons and engraved the phrase, "We remember," in the hangar before disappearing. In cities of the Outer Rim, imperial statues were covered with unrecognized symbols. Entire populations took to the streets in silence. They did not protest. They didn't demand. Just stayed there, with their eyes closed, remembering. Viren ordered the activation of the Red Protocol, total neutralization of any area contaminated by symbolic influence. The order was clear. Where the memory spreads, burn everything. The Empire had won wars by erasing histories, could do it again. She believed in it, had to believe. The protocol was sent. But soon the delays started. Units refused. Some didn't receive it. Others argued. A sector general, Karam Del, responded with a simple phrase. Maybe they are right. And then he vanished. With him, 5 ships. In the symbolic analysis room, the panic was technical. Images of old memories appeared in databases that should have been sealed. Deleted records reappeared spontaneously. Suppressed languages were being read again by automatic systems. A report was brought to Viren. The very computational architecture of the Empire was being rewritten, not by invasion, but in response, as if the systems recognized the truth as an update. Viren shouted for fire, called the final protocol. And with it, the oldest order of the Empire was reactivated. Multi-planetary strategic obliteration. Planets that showed signs of symbolic contagion would be disintegrated with forged core bombs, not to win, but to prevent them from remembering. 7 targets were marked. 3 of them were already ready to be erased. But as the cruisers were aligning, as the authorization codes were being entered, an event occurred. In the command center itself, on the glass wall displaying the real-time galactic map, something burned. Not physically. The glass transformed. A word emerged, burning from within. A word in the Ilion Kai language, regresso. At the same time, field sensors detected a gentle gravitational distortion around the planet. The Exodus Flame, an Imperial orbital command ship, suffered a power failure. And in the sky of Veritas, a spiral of white light appeared for just 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire planet stopped. 3 seconds in which everyone, from soldiers to technicians, had the same vision. A faceless face, made of light and ember, looking at them, and saying, "You can extinguish fire, but you cannot erase living memory." Viren fell to his knees, not out of emotion, but because something inside her gave way. A memory she never knew she had. Of a village, of a childhood, of a song her grandmother used to sing before she was taken away. She cried, and no one dared to comfort her. On the floors below, the fleet stopped. The targets were called off. One by one, the commanders refused the order. And when asked why, they all said the same thing. We don't want to forget who we were. Polar 9 no longer burned. The sky, once opaque and covered in metallic dust, now breathed amber light, not from the sun, but from the very ground. The flame had expanded, not in destruction, but in pulsation. Every time the ground shook, it wasn't collapsing. It was growth, as if the planet were blooming after millennia of silence. In the underground, the living chamber no longer pulsed alone. Roots of memory traversed abandoned tunnels, touched the walls, and illuminated forgotten symbols with gentle warmth. The spark that Cell carried now shone steadily, almost like a miniature heart. She felt the rhythm of the galaxy inside her, a beat that came from afar, yet echoed within her own body. Ryan watched in silence. Much had changed since they set foot there. He no longer wore the helmet. He had set aside the protocols, the codes, and the hierarchy. Now he observed, not as a commander, but as a witness. The surviving soldiers were different, quieter, more aware, as if each one carried a part of something greater than themselves. They were no longer a regiment. They were bearers. USO 17 was sitting near a golden root that sprouted from the floor. He hadn't spoken in days, but his actions said it all. He wrote in the air with his fingers, codes that floated like smoke. The sentences made no sense at first glance, but they repeated in patterns, like an ancestral language seeking a new tongue to be born. One of them said, "The truth only sleeps," and today it woke up. Cell was the first to say out loud what everyone was already feeling. This is not a resistance movement. It's a collective memory organizing itself. It's us, but whole. The decision to leave Volar 9 was not unanimous. Some wanted to stay, protect the flame. Others wanted to go, spread, teach. Cell and Ryan decided together. The planet needed to remain alive, but silent. Not as a weapon, but as a sanctuary. Cell would leave a part of herself there, a neural connection with the flame, so that even from afar, she would know when it called. Ryan would take the symbol with him, and the names. The abandoned extraction ship in the deserts of the Northern Hemisphere was still operational. Cell activated the thrusters. It was rudimentary, old and slow, but safe. They departed at dawn, leaving behind a living spark, and taking with them a truth. The news of the 13th Regiment's desertion had spread, but what reached the distant corners of the galaxy was not an accusation. They were whispers. Voices from isolated systems began to question the silence. In Mir Kaleth, teachers began to teach ancient maps. In Drenhas, sculptors began to create shapes that resembled memories. In Kar-10, a ship that had disappeared 200 years ago appeared floating with the inscription, "We still remember." Cell and Ryan didn't have a fleet. They didn't have money. They had no protection. But where they landed, they found people. People who felt. People who dreamed of things they couldn't name. People who didn't know what the flame was, but who, upon hearing about it, knew it was real. They formed a name, not for marketing nor for rebellion, but out of necessity. The dissidents. They weren't soldiers. They weren't civilians. They were those who had decided to remember, who preferred the pain of truth to the anesthesia of the Empire, that they didn't want to destroy, but to awaken. The first base was built on an abandoned asteroid among the rings of Nathar V. A circle of simple towers, a listening room, a file of symbols, and in the center, a floating projection of the first flame. There in silence, Cell lit the light every night, not out of devotion, but because he knew someone was listening. Ryan recorded a short message, sent through unofficial channels, distributed among old networks forgotten by censorship. The voice was low, tired, and firm. "We are not enemies of the Empire. We are friends of memory. If you feel that something is missing, if you dream of cities that don't exist, if you believe there are names that should be spoken, look for the spark. We are waiting." The broadcast lasted 30 seconds, but it was heard by millions. In the last scene, an Imperial patrol ship passes by a darkened planet. The sensors pick up a faint sound, a frequency outside the normal spectrum. The crew tries to ignore it, but one of the officers, young, new, still pure, listens, and alone he whispers, "I remember." The screen fades to black. The trilogy doesn't end. It just starts to spread.